Hello, and welcome to Mocana's webinar on Endpoint Security Best Practices, implementing the new guidance from the Industrial Internet Consortium. Thanks for joining us. My name is Keao, Caindec. I head up marketing here at Mocana. And today we have two great speakers and contributors to the industry. Dean Weber, our CTO here at Mocana, and also Joe Weiss, Managing Director of Applied Control Solutions, and a longtime participant and visionary within the industrial and industrial control space. Welcome, Dean and Joe. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Today we're going to cover this document that just came out recently, and I'll let Dean talk a little bit about that. But for those of you who have joined, I'll just do a quick intro of who we have on. Joe Weiss is an expert on control systems and electronic security of control systems. He spent more than 14 years at EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute, is a director at IIC's Standards and Practices Board, participates heavily in many of the standards that have been put in place for ISA 99, as well as IIC. And he's published over 80 papers on instrumentation, controls, etc., and also co-authored a book, which was really my first book that I got in this whole industry and getting started, Protecting Industrial Control Systems from Electronic Threats. I don't know what you do with all your free time here, Joe.
Come over here for webinars.
Well, welcome. And Dean Weber, our CTO, was the CTO at CSC's Global Cybersecurity. He is also at Applied Identity and Teros, both of which were acquired by Citrix. There seems to be a pattern there. I'm no big pattern recognition guy, but you know, we're a crypto company. I see these things. Dean also is a frequent speaker, contributor to the space, active, and also a co-author on this document from the IIC that we'll be going through today. So welcome, Dean. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So Dean, kick us off here and tell us a bit about the paper and how it, briefly what it is and really how it got kicked off and started within the security working group at the IIC.
Sure. So, it did start there. It did start with the security working group, which is a subcomponent of the Industrial Internet Consortium, focused purely on security across all of the elements of the participants' platforms and many of the operators that are now starting to join in their implementations. We put together two big seminal papers. One was the Industrial Industry Reference Architecture, and the other one was the Industrial Internet Security Reference Design document, both of which are tome-ish, 400-plus pages. There's a lot of work that went into them. It's a very broad aspect, taking into consideration a lot of the regulatory compliance and audit compliance requirements associated with industrial controls. And what we were really trying to do is we were tasked in the Security Applicability Contributing Group to build documents around putting together the ability to better consume this information. And by consume, I mean something other than 400 pages worth of technical documentation. That documentation, obviously, while a great reference design architecture, is really a lot to consume. So what we tried to do is distill it down into something that was going to be able to get people's arms around the problem set and how to begin the process of understanding industrial security and how it is applicable. We used as our reference a number of the industry standards, including 62443 and 853 R4, soon to be R5, some guidance coming out of Industry 4.0 and BSSL, as well as a number of other individual contributors at the industrial developers level. In putting this together and trying to get a consumable document, this document's 13 pages, around the concept of industrial security and where basically do you start, and then we reference people back to the relevant elements of the industrial security framework and the regulatory elements of 853 R4, R5, and 62443.
Let me ask you guys, if you had to take a swag at the number of pages of documentation for IEC 62443, NIST 800-53, and some of these initial IIC docs, the IISF and IRA, how large of a resource is that for people to get their heads around? I mean, it's got to be thousands of pages.
Yeah, I would suspect you're you're approaching 2,000 pages just from the 853 with its its concomitant additional papers outlining elements of the industrial security framework and how to build risk frameworks, et cetera, and then all the other documents. I mean, they're all in excess of 400 pages.
Yeah, I'll take it one step further. You've got probably, like it's been said, well over 2,000 pages. But the real issue is go back and ask how many of those actually apply to, if you will, these level 0, level 1 devices, the sensors, if you will, the industrial endpoints. Now you start getting back down to very, very, very few pages.
Mm-hmm. Interesting way to look at it. Well, what I find interesting is that this document is about 13 pages, and it's very, very focused on this aspect of endpoint security. And I think it's helpful. And number two, as Dean said, this is really built upon the other frameworks, IEC 62443, the NIST documents, as well as Industry 4.0. So just providing some context here, Dean, this was designed not just for developers, systems designers. This was kind of targeted at educating a broad community. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So again, it wasn't a single target, right? Even though the IIC is comprised basically of the manufacturers themselves, it's their downstream consumers, it's the elements of regulatory control, it's government itself. So NIST has taken a pretty serious look at this document. We're in discussions with Joe and the ISA 99 groups about how we could migrate this into something that was appropriate for ISA 99, or at least have it as a reference document in the work that they're doing. It was really, like I said, that consumption, that consumability concept of it really doesn't matter who you are. This is written in such a way that we hope that it makes sense to people talking about trust anchors and roots of trust and how to build trust chains and where that's appropriate. Is that appropriate for risk factors associated with someone who has very limited means? They may be very intelligent, but they may have limited means in terms of their delivery capabilities, the attacker side, all the way up through near peer nation state type attacks. And using the risk-based approach to say my risk is X, therefore I need Y level of controls. And again, this isn't all of them. This is just trying to get your arms around how you rate things, how you apply controls in order to mitigate the risks associated with those ratings. And again, just using FISMA and 853 as the example, that's all about the confidentiality, integrity, and availability 3x3 matrix that FISMA uses, where you rate your application and then you apply a specific level of controls to that.
Yep. Before we go there, I want to have you, Joe, just talk about your perspective of state of the state and what this document kind of means and that sort of thing.
Yeah, in fact, I want to add one other point. Yesterday, today being the 4th, so we're talking yesterday evening the 3rd, there was an IEEE meeting in San Jose, and it was all about root of trust. And there were a couple of senior people from Cisco that were basically leading this. And the point being, it was almost entirely IT focused And so the words endpoint were very, very specific to things like routers, switches, cell phones, tablets, etc. And there was almost no discussion about things that would be control system specific. One of the things I'm really happy with this document about is trying to really define what endpoint means in a commercial or industrial, or if you will, defense, but in a control system setting. Because there's way too much misunderstanding of the term endpoint. And you'll have both the IT and control system people shaking their heads with the term, and each of them thinking of something else. There's, like I say, a lack of security. That's why we have this new working group within ISA 99. But the other point that I just tried to bring up, you know, when you talked about the number of pages out there on ICS security, there is very, very, very little guidance out there for securing level 01 devices, and it's really, really needed. It's very important.
Right. And real briefly, for those who aren't familiar with level 0, level 1 device, what is that device?
Yeah, and I apologize for not defining it. There is what's known as the Purdue reference model. And that was a model that was pieced together, and it was really time-based. So it's very different than, if you will, the OSI stack, which is, in a sense, network-based.
Sure.
What it was really used for within ISA was they wanted to be able to integrate or be able to take data from the plant distributed control system and get it to the ERPs, the SAPs and Oracles of the world. Well, what the levels are, level 0 is what occurs in real time to microseconds.
Okay.
Level 1 is what occurs from milliseconds to seconds. So that's everything, if you will, that in a sense is considered real time. That's where your sensors, actuators, and drives are.
Got it.
Level 2 are things that would occur seconds to minutes. And that's really where your, you know, at least traditionally, your programmable logic controllers and other devices like that would end. Level 3 would be minutes to hours, and that's where you start having things like your archival databases.
Okay.
And then above that, you're talking about, you know, hours to days. That's long-term storage, or in a sense, for people that may have read about it, there was the hacks of 4 different pipeline systems yesterday, and that was all, if you will, would be up at the level 4 layer, because that's, if you will, the customer information.
Sure.
Okay.
Right.
And so what's really dealing here is with things that have to function in somewhere between real time to no more than seconds.
Great, really helpful. I mean, it seems, you know, pretty clear, but talk a little bit about why this is really important. Why protecting these endpoints are important, and why, how this, you know, why you think it matters.
Well, the point is, sensors, actuators, and drives are what directly affect both productivity and safety. Not second order, but first order. So the idea of the more accurate a sensor is, if you will, the more you can optimize a process. Or conversely, if it isn't, you have all of these losses. The sensors are also the input to any safety issue.
Right.
The actuators and drives, if you will, are what will carry out the function.
Sure.
So these are, if you will, the most important part of any physical process, and it turns out the network is simply, if you will, the middle part
Right.
for the communication.
Well, also, you know, these level 0, level 1 devices a decade ago or more had very little resources, capabilities. Today, they're really important still, but additionally, they may be connected to networks in different ways. They may have much more processing power. We're moving to somewhere between edge analytics and measurement and real-time decision-making pushed further and further out to the quote-unquote edge. And I think endpoints in general, whether they fall between a level 0, level 1 device, some sort of distributed analytics device, or a programmable logic controller at the edge, the reality is those are all still vulnerable today.
And there's one other thing, and this came out in a week ago Thursday's ISA level 0, level 1 call. And that is that, number one, we're pushing the intelligence further and further down into the process. So effectively, we're making a lot of these devices almost mini controllers in themselves. The other is there's connections all the way down from those devices directly to the cloud.
Yeah, right.
So
wow.
One of the things that's changing is these 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 levels are no longer, if you will, serial. You can jump around them. So what's happening is with this intelligence, you go from measuring to be able to do real-time control right there at the process, but then also sending that information directly to the cloud.
Sure.
And right now, there is minimal security when we're doing all of this, as well as minimal authentication.
Right.
So what is happening here and where IIC is going is really important, because we're effectively extending the engineering part of the process now directly to the cloud.
Sure. So any other insights on the document that you want to share?
Well, there's a couple of things that were in there that I thought were really important too. One is that it's agnostic. It really basically says this isn't electric, or it's not water, it's not chemicals. This is wherever you're using these sensors and actuators or drives. And the last thing is, and to me there should be common sense to everybody, but it's driving us to a better engineering end, which is being able to verify in real time what is happening with the process, which is the right engineering thing to do, whether you're talking security, safety, productivity, or any other reason.
Sure. Well, I think for many years we've had a focus on securing the network, right? And also using a lot of these safety and control processes maintain safety. And somewhere along the way, we've lost sight of the fact that we haven't really done all we can to protect the devices themselves. For example, your thoughts about root of trust in IT, right? There are private keys baked into silicon in all 95 or more % of laptops and servers that go out.
Yes.
There's significant security that we use in those IT endpoints. But we have not really pushed ourselves as an industry to take a look at those devices and what can be done. And that is really the focus of this discussion here. And endpoints, we talked about that. Talk about the these. I'm going to jump ahead a bit. Is there anything you want to share about just endpoint definition with regard to the paper, Dean?
Sure. Well, I mean, so
Yeah,
we stole a page out of IIIE to do that. We describe an endpoint at the IIC level, specifically at the Security Working Group level, as any device with a computational capacity and with a communications capability. So that can be any device that is got some level of control or microcontrol built in it, where there's a decision logic associated with A versus B, and some ability to communicate, whether that's serial or RF or cellular. It really doesn't matter. LAN, WAN, as long as they have the ability to communicate and they have a computational capacity, that is a description of the endpoint from an IIC perspective.
Yep. And as you know, we were mentioning earlier, people do think about those in terms of network devices, servers, some types of other devices. But now including that, the sensors and actuators out there actually have computational ability built into chips and certainly network capabilities.
One last point. Go ahead, Dean.
The issue here is real time, right? I mean,
yeah.
This is literally real-time function, meaning that it's not something that you're going to create a paper, you're going to scan the paper, you're going to transmit the paper via email, someone else is going to decipher the email, an authentication process. I mean, all of that takes time. So to Joe's earlier point, real-time is about making a decision right now, because in industrial controls, that decision right now is critical to the overall safety and reliability of the platform. And one of the problems that we've run into with the industrial community writ large is the operating engineers have for years relied on safety and reliability systems, whether they were 100% redundancy or whether they were separate communications capabilities altogether. The problem, of course, is that they are all communicating integrally today, meaning that they all have common communications paths, whether that's up to the cloud or up to the ICS SCADA level or wherever that is, and all of these devices are vulnerable on the network. I mean, if there's one thing that Stuxnet showed us, is there's no such thing as a protected network any longer.
Yep. Let's dive right into it. Lead us into the this discussion on the different levels of endpoints or types of endpoints as the document categorizes.
Well, and again, we took pages out of lots of different books. So I'll just use as an example 62443 3-3, where there are 5 levels defined, level 0 being the lowest, and that means no security. Level 1, which means there may be password level authentication, to Joe's earlier point, a very minimal amount of authentication and probably no authorization or validation. Level 2 is where you start getting into risk versus control, and level 2 is about against an attacker or a group of attackers that don't have extravagant means, individuals or cyber criminals. Moving up to level 3, now you've got individuals or cyber criminals that are, and even some nation-state near-peer work that have good means but not extravagant means. And then when you get up to level 4, you're talking about, you know, the super majors of the world, where we have a lot of capacity to spend a lot of time on the espionage aspects and the tradecraft aspects of actually being able to compromise over time an industrial control system and thereby either force it into some type of shutdown, as we've seen recently, or even if that's just in a diffusion standpoint, where, like with Black Energy 3+, we had not only the power generation capacity, but secondary and tertiary attacks that were proposed against the transportation and the mining industries.
Right.
So in essence, what we did at the paper level is we took those 3 and we said, okay, so equivalent to IIC 3-3 level 2 would be considered basic. It would be considered that something that everything in a critical path would have to have at least a basic security process, and then we help to define and describe what that basic security process would look like. And then we do the same thing at level 3, right, which is the enhanced level, and then we do the same thing at level 4. And you can equate those similarly to something like FISMA low, medium, and high in the 853 R4 and R5s. You can do the same thing with some of the BSSL guidance, the BSSL guidance, the Industry 4.0 guidance, the NIST guidance in additional papers, et cetera, et cetera.
So we're going to go through the best practices for these types of endpoints, 3 different types. How would an end user, operator, or manufacturer determine where their devices fit into these levels?
So, I mean, most of the industrial community has dealt with risk profiles far longer than the IT communities have. So they have a very, very solid understanding of risk. That's where safety and reliability has come in, because if a risk exists, then a proper mitigation of that risk must also exist in order for the system to go live. The idea behind that as a security element, which is the third leg of the stool, right? You got safety and you got reliability. Now you have a cyber aspect that has to be brought into bear as well. And it fits into that risk profile the same way. We have to evaluate the infrastructure, which means everything from the sensors through the DCS levels on up through the ICS SCADA world, and then potentially on out into the analytics platform, whether that's local or remote type cloud architectures. But the idea is that we've got to assess our risks, which we've already got a solid framework in industrial to build from. We just have to take into consideration the cyber aspect. And part of that is spelled out in 62443 and 4-2 and 4-1. Part of that is spelled out in the additional framework from NIST, right? So there's guidance out there in terms of how do you develop the risk profile for these elements to include cyber, building on what you've already got, which is a solid foundation in safety and reliability, and then going upwards from there. Once you have a cyber risk described, then what are your mitigating controls for the cyber risk?
Right. Okay. Let's dive into basic and what's in it. Talk to us about that.
Sure. So, I mean, again, the point of all this is that if we're going to trust the data that is being generated, which is, contributing to the decision logic of should the valve be open or should the valve be closed? And if the valve is open, what ancillary functions need to occur? We have to be able to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that that device's logic is intact. In order to do that, you need to measure from something approaching power applied all the way through application execution, coming back to the description of endpoint. If it's got a compute capacity and it's got a communications capability, then we need to be able to secure it. In order to secure it in real time, there is not a detect and respond type model as there is in the IT world. There's not a bolt-on, bolt-on, bolt-on that you can really do here. So this is getting your arms around how do you bake security into these platforms. And the answer that IIC has proposed in all of the work that we've done there relative to security is you've got to start from a root of trust. You have to have some concept of whether or not the platform is booted properly, and then some of the application security functions in terms of the endpoint's identity, any cryptographic services, and secure communications all has to be built on. Now that doesn't, it sounds pretty complex, but it's really not, right? We're talking about a certificate could potentially be a root of trust, or a firmware element could potentially be a root of trust. And all of the rest of this is layered on top of that. If I have something to start from that is known trustworthy, and I can build on that through something like X509 trust chaining, I can say all of the additional signed elements in the platform are known good to me, and the top-level cryptographic value associated with that is the value that I expect. That proves, beyond a shadow of doubt, to the strength of the crypto that you've chosen to use, or cipher suites that you've chosen to use, that you actually have a secure platform. Then the data being generated from those platforms is now trustworthy, and you're communicating that over secure communications.
Got it. So this would be a device that would be IEC 62443-3 level 2.
Correct.
Stepping up to
or
enhanced
FISMA low.
Or FISMA low. Okay. Stepping up from there, what do we add in for enhanced?
Well, we're going to add in the concept of configuration management and additional strengthening of the security controls to get to that configuration management. So again, we may not be talking about a valve at this point. We may be talking about some more complex element of control. It might be a jet engine controller, or it might be a turbine controller, or it might be a steering system on a naval vessel. Or, I mean, there's a lot of things that are the next step up from basic that are integral parts of other systems that the risk profile says this is important, but it's not critical. If this were to be damaged, if the data that this device generated was not trustworthy, I'd want to know about it, but it's not going to shut the system down. It's not going to force us into a shutdown condition, as an example. So building on a stronger root of trust means a stronger secure element, right, whatever the root of trust is, and then that secure boot, the endpoint identity, the cryptographic services, and the secure communications committantly become more secure because they're based on a more solid foundation, and then we add in that concept of endpoint configuration and management structures so that we now have active controls over exactly what's on the platform.
Got it. And then go ahead, Joe.
I was just going to mention one thing. What I would consider to be basic good engineering is having good configuration management. Because step away from security. If you don't know what you have, it's not just how can you secure it, but how can you manage it or run it.
Oh, yes. Right.
And so, to me, that really should be basic to anything and everything you have.
And I'll tell you, configuration and management is complicated. We're not going to go into it here, but it has to do with, today, a very manual, cumbersome, painful process of enrolling devices, getting identities into them, managing updates securely, and this is an important piece of it. I completely agree.
And I just want to take it further, and then I'll back away.
No problem.
In all of the assessments I've done over the years, I've yet to go out to any facility and not find things installed in the field that people didn't realize was there. So not only do you have the issue, if you will, from the security side of quote-unquote enrolling devices, et cetera, we have a major problem of knowing what is connected to what. And that's why I'm saying what's basic is understanding what you have.
Good point. So that was enhanced. Talk about critical, and when you get to this critical SL4 level, what's added there and what that means.
Well, again, we've gone to considerably enhance to the security of the stack itself, meaning that now we're talking about hardware roots of trust. Now we're talking about multi-stage secure boot statements and multiple signatories and 2 and more man rules for things like update. And then the endpoint identity is now at a strong cryptographic level. We're talking about using strong PKI architectures associated with these devices so that the identities cannot be compromised easily. And then moving all the way up, right, so the cryptographic services, the comms, the configuration management are all becoming stronger now. And then we add in the concept of what do we do with those elements? How do we report those elements? How is that visualized by the operators themselves? And adding in that aspect of it's not just safety and reliability, green light, yellow light, red light, but it's also cyber, red light, yellow light, green light, right? It's are we cyber secure, not just safety and reliability secure? So the idea is to take all of this information that we're now generating as trustworthy data to include configuration management, to include endpoint status and identities, and roll all of those up into something that is usable at the ICS SCADA level or above in terms of, is the element secure, and if so, why, and how do I know?
That's great. We had a question come in on endpoint secure. Endpoint devices are designed for low power consumption. For example, wireless transmitter or a PoE device. Implementing cryptographic services on such a device would drain power because crypto is known to be CPU intensive. They would like to hear some comments on that. Dean, you want to take a swag at that?
And we deal with a lot of those, right? So in terms of the IIC reference architecture, we've seen everything from shutdown switches that have to be cryptographically secure, but their battery life, their shelf life is 10 years, meaning that device has to sit on a wall, battery powered for 10 years, and effectively be an emergency shutdown for an operation. And it needs to be known as a function of risk management that it is there and that it is secure. And basically the way to do that is you wake it up, you exchange a key set. It doesn't necessarily have to be a full crypto stack, right? It depends on the element that you're dealing with. Obviously, we're not talking about adding massive amounts of expense to the endpoint to add in appropriate level crypto processing. Crypto is not just necessarily crypto, right? I mean, it's not just a cryptographic engine. It's cryptographically secure elements of that communication, whether that's a signing or endorsement of the elements themselves, and whether that's a local or remote attestation of those elements. There's lots of ways to address the overall problem of, as long as the endpoint meets the bare minimum criteria of it can communicate, and it does have processing capability, our ability to add in things like X509 certificates or other forms of stronger identity, our ability to use PKI, even if it's in a wake-up mode where it's only used at specific junctions and elements, all of those are possible in the industrial community.
I will say one other thing. There's been work ongoing in the crypto world to try to reduce the amount of overhead simply for the reason that was asked. And one of the things, too, is there's, part of the risk assessment is how strong of, quote unquote, I'll just use a term, identity management you need.
Exactly.
You don't, depending on what it is, it may just be a small hash. I think too many people get carried away by saying it's crypto and therefore it's heavy duty. It doesn't have to be. Dean, you're in a better position to talk about that than me. But the point is, it doesn't have to be heavy duty, or you could do it like the.
I would say it's a little bit different. It doesn't have to be processor intensive.
That is correct.
For example, implementing secure boot technologies using a hardware-based root of trust or a software-based root of trust that has been implemented in a secure way can be very effective to ensure that the device has a reliable and trustworthy identity, and that the process doesn't take too much processing time. And you can have lighter weight crypto to what can be supported on a 64 kilobyte RAM or 256 KB RAM type of device. One thing that was interesting, I'll just call this out, root of trust. You talked about that. For the basic level, it outlines that a software-based root of trust is acceptable. As you move up, for firmware and hardware-based is more important. And as you get up to SL4, or what we call enhanced, you really should have a hardware-based root of trust, a TPM chip, Intel EPID, something strong really baked into the device that can be attested to.
And we have a question on that exact element right this minute.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead. I didn't. Oh, yeah. Huh. Go ahead. Why don't you take that one? ARM Trust Zone security extension considered a platform for hardware-based roots of trust. towards meeting ICS requirements. Critical. Yeah.
The short answer, Dean's opinion, is no, because it's electrically alterable. Same way with Intel EPID. If you add EPID into SGX with a second level of validation of trust, now you're approaching real hardware. But hardware in a hardened development like ATPM is really where level 4 or critical is designed to operate. And we're seeing that in industrial and high-end industrial and military type applications where we're adding in hardware roots of trust to ARM-based architectures, even though the TE Trust Zone architecture has its own mechanisms. And you're seeing that also in unvalidated technologies at this point with things like PUF, the physically uncodable device level functions. But again, all of that is electrically alterable, so with physical access, kind of all bets are off, where with a TPM, you have a containerized approach to root of trust, which, depending on the level of certification that you're looking for, can go all the way up from FIPS 140-2 level 1 through level 4.
Yes. I think what might be helpful is to talk more practically about how we have actually put this into practice. Give people an example of how this was done.
Yeah, we've only got 3 more minutes, and I see there's another question up.
Yeah. Before we jump into that, if you could just talk a bit about how we have put this into practice and how this is actually possible on a platform.
Sure, and it plays right into the question that we just answered, which is, so a Xilinx UltraScale Plus has an internal PUF and 2 internal cryptographic functions associated with BIOS and first-stage bootloader. And that's great for elements that only require that typically be at the level 3 architectural models. If you wanted to get to a level 4, you need to add a hardware root of trust for the additional functions, even though the PUF itself can be used for secure BIOS, secure boot. It really isn't addressing the things like pre-post architectures and post bootloaders in terms of second stage and potentially third stage, and then on up through the application stack. All of that has yet to be validated. So the short answer there is that what we're proposing in architectures actually is, again, based against the risk elements that are defined in how do you mitigate the risks against those types of attacks. And the answer is, if physical access is part of the attack architecture or potential proximity to the device, these are things that need to be mitigated in additional ways, which is really where SL4 is situated.
Right. And then, thank you. The question about the SL levels being vague, there's some feeling that they're vague, and question around how you determine the security to be implemented at hardware, embedded software, TPM, et cetera, for these definitions.
So yes, the short answer is the SL levels are I won't say vague. I would say they're ambiguous in terms of meeting a particular element abstraction. But that's the case with everything when it comes to regulatory compliance, because there's an element of interpretation no matter what you look at, right? I mean, even applying 853 to an industrial military grade system isn't necessarily a guarantee that you will get the same interpretation twice. The idea of a primary control, of a compensating control, and then potential for a POAM, a plan of actions and milestones, to achieve either a primary or a compensating control over time, or other risk mitigating functions that may be able to be put in place around the element. These are all localized considerations. So ultimately the answer to the third question there is that when you're making claims in terms of compliance with 62443 or NIST, or whether you're doing an audit against a safety and control guidance reference architecture to include the risk elements, you're defining what those are. And when you define something as critical, You want to do everything you can. You want to throw the kitchen sink at it. In order to throw the kitchen sink at it, you need to have a hardware root of trust. And I hope that answers the question.
Anything to add on that?
Yeah, I would just add, as an engineer, what I would basically say is you do a risk assessment. And the real question is, how critical is it to you? And that's what should basically be your judgment as to what, to how much security to really employ. But it's got to come from risk.
Yep. Yeah. So the link is available in the to the audience. We'll also be following up with you with links to that as well as this presentation. There's a lot in this paper, but it is 13 pages. It's pretty easy to consume. We are happy to help you understand it, have follow-up calls with you should you require. Please just reach out to us via our website at mocana.com. We've got a lot of people here who care about this, and we want to help everyone to make it easy to put security in these devices and also begin to move toward an easier way to think about what should be done on the device to protect them, as opposed to what we're doing today. We know things need to change. So with that, we're out of time today for this. And again, thank you all for joining the webinar. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy day. And please do follow up with us if you have other questions about the document or about how to implement according to these guidelines. Thank you very much, and have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gene. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you. '94.